She walks the palace corridors. Her sons carried the queen's crown at the coronation. But behind the...
Laura Lopes had been quietly building something inside palace circles for months. She had not been loud about it. She had not drawn attention to what she was doing or sought the kind of press coverage that would have made her intentions visible to people outside the specific networks she was working within. She had been patient and deliberate in the way that people are patient and deliberate when they understand that what they are trying to achieve requires careful groundwork rather than direct confrontation. Then Catherine found out what she was doing. The block that followed was swift, specific, and communicated in terms that left no room for negotiation. And Laura Lopes, who had spent her adult life maintaining the kind of dignified public silence that her position as Camilla's daughter required, responded in a way that stunned the people inside Buckingham Palace, who thought they understood exactly how this situation was going to unfold. What did Laura do? And what does it mean for Camilla's already narrowing world inside the institution? The daughter nobody talks about, Laura Lopes, is 51 years old, and she has spent most of those years being the royal adjacent figure that the press never quite knows what to do with. She is Camilla's daughter from her first marriage to Andrew Parker Bowles, which ended in divorce in 1995. She has a brother, Tom Parker Bowles, who has built a public profile as a food writer and television personality, and who appears in media coverage connected to the royal family with enough regularity that his face is recognizable to people who follow these things closely. Laura has maintained a considerably lower profile than her brother across the years of their mother's public life, and that lower profile has been, by every account of people who know her, a deliberate choice rather than an accident of circumstance. She married Harry Lopes in 2006, a year after Camilla married Charles, and the timing of that wedding placed it in the specific period when the public's relationship with Camilla was still deeply complicated, and when anything connected to Camilla's family was subject to a level of scrutiny that most people would have found genuinely difficult to navigate with grace. Laura navigated it with grace. She has continued to do so across the 20 years since. Her relationship with the royal family has always occupied a specific and carefully maintained position. She is not a royal. She holds no title. She has no official role within any of the palace structures that govern how the institution operates and how it presents itself to the public. She is the daughter of the queen consort and the stepdaughter of the king, and those relationships give her a connection to the institution that is real and significant without being formal or official in any of the ways that formal or official connections to the British royal family are typically understood. That specific position, connected enough to matter but not official enough to be defined, has required Laura to navigate the palace world with a particular kind of care that is different from what working royals face and different from what people entirely outside the institution face. She has had access to people and spaces and occasions that the general public does not have access to, and she has exercised that access with a discretion that the people around Camilla have consistently described as one of her most significant qualities. She attends events. She maintains relationships with people inside the household. She is present at the occasions where Camilla's family gathers around her, and she conducts herself at those occasions with the specific awareness of someone who understands that her behavior reflects on her mother in ways that require her to be more careful, not less, than she might otherwise choose to be. Her relationship with Camilla is close in the way that the relationships between mothers and daughters who have been through difficult things together tend to be close. Laura was a teenager when the affair between Camilla and Charles became public knowledge in the way that it became public knowledge in the 1990s. She watched her mother become one of the most publicly criticized women in Britain, and she absorbed what that experience did to Camilla and to the family around her with the specific attentiveness of a young person who loves a parent and cannot protect them from what is happening, but can be present for it. That shared experience created a bond between them that has remained evident across the decades since, even as Laura's own life has developed in directions that have nothing to do with the royal world. She is a mother herself, with 3 children of her own. She has her own relationships, her own interests, her own identity that exists entirely outside the palace orbit. But she has never stopped being Camilla's daughter in the sense that matters most, which is the sense of someone who shows up when it counts, and who considers loyalty to her mother a priority that outweighs the personal inconvenience that loyalty sometimes creates. The palace world has always been careful about how it categorizes Laura's presence within it. She is not included in official royal documentation in the way that working royals and their immediate family members are included. She does not appear on lists of official attendees at state occasions in a way that would give her presence at those occasions formal institutional weight. She moves through the world, connected to the palace with the specific invisibility that people who are close to power without officially possessing it tend to maintain when they are operating intelligently within that world. That invisibility has served her well across the years of Camilla's marriage to Charles. It has allowed her to maintain a relationship with the institution without becoming a target for the specific kind of scrutiny that her brother Tom's higher public profile has sometimes attracted. It has also, and this is the element that becomes significant in the context of what happened in the months leading up to Catherine's intervention, allowed Laura to build relationships within palace circles that have not been widely visible to people outside those circles. Those relationships are what the situation is actually about. In the years since Charles became king and Camilla became queen consort, Laura's quiet presence within palace-adjacent circles has gradually expanded. Not dramatically, not in ways that attracted significant attention from the people whose job it is to track how the palace's informal social and professional networks develop and shift over time, but consistently, in the specific way that presence expands when someone is deliberate about it and patient enough not to push faster than the environment they are operating within will comfortably accommodate. She had been building connections, relationships with people inside the household, structures that govern how the palace operates day to day. Familiarity with spaces and occasions and the informal rhythms of institutional life that take time to develop and that, once developed, give a person a kind of embedded presence that is difficult to dislodge without a deliberate decision to do so. She had been doing this across the period of Charles's reign with the quiet patience that has always characterized how she operates in spaces where she is adjacent to power without officially holding any. And then something changed in the specific nature of what she was seeking to establish. And that change was what Catherine eventually became aware of. What Laura was seeking, and why the shift in what Laura was attempting to establish within palace circles did not happen overnight. It developed gradually across the second half of 2025, during a period when the internal dynamics of the palace were themselves shifting in ways that created both opportunity and risk for people operating in the spaces adjacent to formal power. Charles's health was the primary driver of those shifting dynamics. His continued management of his cancer treatment through that period had produced a redistribution of day-to-day authority within the palace that was real and consequential even when it was not publicly visible in any dramatic way. People who had previously needed to route decisions through the king's office directly were finding that those decisions were increasingly being managed through William's expanding circle of influence, and the people who understood how institutional power actually moves inside a structure like the British royal family were adjusting their relationships and their positioning accordingly. Laura was adjusting hers. What she was specifically seeking has been described by sources familiar with the situation in terms that are consistent enough across separate accounts to produce a reliable picture. She was attempting to establish a more formal and more durable connection to the household structures that would survive the transition from Charles's reign to William's in a way that her current informal presence would not. The informal presence she had built across the years of Charles's reign depended on Camilla's position for its vitality. As long as Camilla was queen consort and Charles was king, Laura's access to palace circles was underwritten by the authority and the goodwill that her mother's position generated. People within those circles welcomed Laura's presence because her mother was the king's wife, and because maintaining good relationships with the people close to Camilla was simply prudent behavior inside a structure where Camilla's influence was real and ongoing. But Laura was aware, in the way that intelligent people connected to institutions in transition tend to be aware, that the foundations of her access were shifting beneath her. Camilla's position was narrowing. The ceremony at Windsor where the crown had been placed on Catherine's head had made that narrowing visible in the most public way possible. But the narrowing had been occurring at the institutional level for longer than that ceremony suggested. William's expanding authority, the decisions he had made about the Duchy of Cornwall and the people around it, the legal protections Anne had established at Sandringham, all of these developments had been gradually reducing the space within which Camilla's influence operated, and therefore reducing the space within which Laura's access was underwritten by her mother's position. Laura understood this. She is not someone who misses implications, and the implication of everything that had been happening inside the palace across the preceding months was clear enough that missing it would have required a degree of inattention that she simply does not possess. She was watching her mother's institutional ground shrink, and she was thinking carefully about what that meant for her own position within the palace world, and what she could do to establish a foundation for that position that did not depend entirely on Camilla's continued influence. The specific approach she was making involved relationships with people inside William's household structure, not William himself. Laura was too careful and too experienced in the dynamics of palace life to attempt a direct approach to the future king, when the history between her family and his made the reception of such an approach unpredictable at best. She was working through the layers below William, through the senior members of his household staff and the advisors who managed the practical operations of the Prince of Wales's office, through the social and professional networks that connect the palace's working level to the people who actually implement the decisions that the senior royals make. She was building the kinds of relationships that give a person embedded presence within an institutional structure, regardless of who the senior figure at the top of that structure is at any given moment. The relationships that survive transitions because they are built with the people who remain constant through those transitions, rather than with the figure at the top who changes. It was an intelligent strategy. It was also one that required a level of discretion to execute successfully, because the specific relationships she was building were ones that would have been immediately complicated if their purpose became visible to the people at the top of William's household, before Laura had established enough of a foundation to make her presence feel natural rather than strategic. The discretion was held for several months. Then it did not hold, and the reason it did not hold reflects something about how palace networks actually function that Laura may have underestimated in her assessment of how carefully she could pursue the strategy she had chosen. Palace households are not large. The number of people with genuine access to the working levels of William's operation is not the kind of number that allows a sustained relationship-building effort to remain invisible to the senior figures within that operation for an indefinite period of time. People talk. Not maliciously, in most cases. They talk the way people talk inside any professional environment, where relationships and social dynamics are part of the operating landscape. They mention things in passing. They reference interactions that seemed notable. They create, through the ordinary social communication of professional life, a picture of what is happening around them that becomes visible to the people paying attention to that picture. Someone inside William's household was paying attention. That someone brought what they had observed to Catherine rather than to William. And the reason for that choice of recipient reflects something important about how Catherine's role within the household had evolved across the period of William's expanding authority. Catherine had become, in the practical operation of the household, the person who managed the social and relational dimensions of the institutional environment that William's more strategic focus did not always have bandwidth to monitor closely. William was occupied with the larger picture, with the transition of authority, with the management of Charles's illness and its implications, with the Andrew situation and the Camilla tension and the accumulation of significant institutional decisions that the period had required of him. Catherine was occupied with the texture of the environment in which all of those larger decisions were being made, with the relationships and the dynamics and the informal social landscape that shapes how institutions actually function, regardless of what the formal decision-making structures look like on paper. She was, in this specific and practical sense, the person in the household most likely to notice what Laura was doing and most positioned to understand its significance. When the information reached her, she understood its significance immediately, and she made a decision about what to do with it that was as swift and as unambiguous as anything she had done in years of navigating a role that had required her to be measured and careful and deliberate in ways that left very little room for the kind of decisive action that the situation with Laura called for. How Catherine found out and what she did. The person who brought the information to Catherine was a senior member of William's household staff who had been present in the operational environment long enough to recognize when something happening around them required attention at a level above their own. They had not been approached directly by Laura. Their awareness of what Laura was doing had developed through the ordinary processes of professional observation inside a household. where the social and relational landscape was dense enough that patterns of behavior became visible to attentive people, without those patterns needing to be pointed out explicitly. They had watched Laura's interactions with specific members of the household across a period of several months, and had concluded that what they were observing was deliberate rather than casual, and significant rather than routine. They had sat with that conclusion for several weeks before deciding that bringing it to Catherine was the appropriate response to what they had seen. The decision to bring it to Catherine rather than to William was not accidental, and it was not a reflection of any uncertainty about whether the matter was serious enough to reach the principal level of the household. It was a specific judgment that the nature of what was happening, the social and relational dimension of it, made Catherine the more appropriate recipient of the information than William, whose focus on larger institutional questions would have made this specific kind of relational intelligence less immediately legible to him than it would be to someone whose attention was more closely attuned to the texture of the environment. Catherine received the information on a morning in late November 2025. She was in a working meeting with members of her own team when the staff member requested a brief private moment, and she stepped out of the meeting with the specific calm of someone who has learned, across years of royal life, that the moments requiring that kind of interruption are moments where composure at the point of receiving information is more useful than any other immediate response. She listened to what was being described without interrupting. She asked 3 questions when the account was complete, and the questions she asked were specific enough that the person delivering the information understood that she had grasped the situation fully from the description, rather than needing it elaborated or explained further. The first question was about the specific relationships Laura had been building and the length of time over which she had been building them. The second was about whether any of those relationships had produced access to information or spaces within the household that went beyond the social level, into the operational level, where actual institutional decisions were made or implemented. The third was about whether anyone else within the household was aware of what had been happening to the same degree that the staff member bringing the information was aware of it. The answers she received confirmed her initial assessment of the situation's significance. She did not discuss it with William immediately. That decision reflects something important about how Catherine approaches situations that require action at the household level. She does not bring things to William before she has assessed them fully and determined what she believes the appropriate response is, because bringing something to him before that assessment is complete creates a dynamic where his response shapes her thinking rather than her thinking informing the joint decision that they make together. She needed to understand the full picture before that conversation happened, and she spent the remainder of that day and most of the following one doing exactly that. She had quiet conversations with 2 other members of the household who she trusted to give her an honest account of what they had observed and what they understood its implications to be. She reviewed her own recollections of interactions involving Laura at occasions where their paths had crossed over the preceding months, recollections that took on a different quality in the context of what she had just been told. By the end of the second day, she had a picture that was complete enough to act on. The action she took was not dramatic in its form, even though its implications were significant. Catherine did not summon Laura to a meeting. She did not issue a formal communication through official channels that would have created a documented record of the block and the reasoning behind it. She did not involve palace lawyers or household administrators in the process of communicating the decision she had reached. She communicated it through a trusted intermediary with existing connections to both households, in the same kind of private and undocumented channel that the palace uses for communications of this nature, when the goal is clarity without confrontation and resolution without institutional record. The message that was communicated on Catherine's behalf was specific and complete. It acknowledged that Laura had been building relationships within William's household and indicated that those relationships were not going to develop in the direction Laura had intended them to develop. It made clear that the access Laura had been working toward was not access that the household was in a position to extend, and it communicated that understanding in terms that left no room for the interpretation that the position might change if the approach were modified, or the timing adjusted. It was a block in the fullest sense of that word, delivered without anger and without elaboration, in the specific register of someone who has made a decision they are completely clear about, and who sees no purpose in dressing it in language that might suggest otherwise. The reasoning behind Catherine's decision has not been publicly stated, because Catherine does not publicly state the reasoning behind decisions of this nature. She makes them and communicates them, and allows the clarity of the communication to speak for the reasoning, without requiring the reasoning to be defended or explained. But sources familiar with her thinking during this period describe a position that was informed by several considerations operating simultaneously. The most fundamental consideration was the one that informed every significant decision Catherine had been making about the household environment across the period of William's expanding authority. She was building something. The institutional foundation of the next reign was being constructed in real time, and every element of that construction required careful attention to who was inside the environment in which it was happening and what their relationship to that environment actually was. Laura's presence within the household's relational networks, if it developed to the level she was working toward, would have introduced a connection to Camilla's world into the operational texture of William's household that Catherine had no intention of allowing. It was not personal animosity toward Laura that drove the decision. People familiar with Catherine's thinking are consistent on this point, and it is worth being precise about it because the easy interpretation of what she did is one that frames it as a personal conflict between two women with competing loyalties and interests. That framing is too simple and too narrow to capture what was actually happening. Catherine's decision was institutional, in the same way that William's decision about Annabel Elliot had been institutional. It was about who had a connection to the environment being built and what the nature of that connection was and whether it served the purposes of the institution being constructed or introduced, complications that the institution could not afford. Laura's connection to that environment was a connection routed through Camilla, and Camilla's relationship to the institution of the next reign was one that Catherine had clear and settled views about. Camilla's influence within the environment William was building was not going to expand through her daughter any more than it had been allowed to expand through her sister. Catherine had watched William establish that principle with Annabel Elliot. She was applying it with Laura Lopes, and she was applying it in her own way, through the social and relational mechanisms that were her specific domain, rather than through the financial and contractual mechanisms that had been William's. Laura received the communication within 48 hours of Catherine making the decision to send it. The intermediary delivered it in person, in a private setting, with the care that a communication of this sensitivity required. Laura listened to what was being communicated and asked one question when the delivery was complete, which was whether the decision had come from Catherine specifically or from the household more broadly. The intermediary confirmed that it had come from Catherine and that it represented the household's position. Laura thanked the intermediary for delivering it and ended the conversation. What happened after that conversation ended was not what anyone inside the palace had expected from a woman who had spent her adult life maintaining the kind of careful, composed public silence that her position had always required of her. Laura's response and why, it stunned everyone. Laura Lopes had spent 20 years being the quiet one, while her brother Tom wrote books and appeared on television and built a public profile that kept him consistently visible in the media landscape connected to the royal family. Laura had maintained the specific invisibility that her position required, and that her temperament, by every account of people who know her, genuinely suited. She was not someone who sought attention or who used her connection to her mother's position as a platform for her own visibility. That established pattern was what made what she did next so unexpected. She spoke publicly, and she did so in terms that were carefully constructed, but unmistakably pointed in a way that nobody who knew her history of deliberate silence had anticipated. She gave a brief interview to a journalist with whom she had a long-standing relationship, in a context that was not explicitly connected to the royal family, but in which the connection was unmistakable to anyone with knowledge of the situation. She spoke about the experience of being adjacent to institutions that make decisions about people without those people having any meaningful voice in the process. She spoke about the specific difficulty of navigating spaces where the rules are unwritten and the consequences of misreading them are communicated after the fact rather than in advance. She did not name Catherine. She did not reference the palace directly or describe the specific communication she had received. She spoke in terms that were general enough to be deniable as a direct response to what had happened, and specific enough that everyone who knew what had happened understood exactly what she was describing. The interview landed inside the palace with the specific impact of something that was not supposed to exist. Laura Lopes was not supposed to be someone who responded to palace decisions in any public forum. She was supposed to absorb whatever the institution communicated to her, with the same dignified silence she had always maintained, and continue conducting herself in the way that her mother's position had always required of the people connected to it. Her decision to respond differently stunned the people inside Buckingham Palace, who had assumed that the block Catherine had communicated would be received and processed privately. The way these things were always received and processed by people in Laura's position. She had violated the unwritten contract that governs how people adjacent to the palace handle communications of this nature, and she had done it in a way that was controlled enough to be difficult to respond to directly, but visible enough that ignoring it entirely was not a comfortable option either. Catherine's response to what Laura had done was one of measured acknowledgement rather than escalation. She did not issue a statement. She did not direct anyone within the household to respond publicly to what Laura had said. She absorbed the interview and the attention it generated with the composure that has always defined how she handles situations that test the boundaries of what her role requires of her. But people close to Catherine describe her private response as one of genuine surprise mixed with a respect she had not expected to feel for a woman whose position she had just made considerably more difficult. Laura had done something unexpected, and Catherine, whatever the institutional implications of it, found that she could not entirely fault someone for refusing to be silent about an experience that silence had been expected to simply absorb. What this means for Camilla's dwindling circle, the pattern is clear enough now that naming it does not require interpretation. Annabel Elliot was removed from the Duchy of Cornwall payroll when William took control of the estate. Laura Lopes has been blocked from establishing the kind of embedded presence within William's household that would have given her access independent of her mother's diminishing position. The circle of people connected to Camilla, who retain meaningful access to the institutional environment being built around the next reign, is shrinking in ways that are deliberate and consistent, and that reflect a principle rather than a series of unconnected decisions. Camilla's world inside the palace is narrowing. That process has been underway for longer than the public record has made visible, and it is accelerating as the transition toward William's reign moves from theoretical to operational. For Camilla herself, Laura's public response to Catherine's block introduced a complication that she had not anticipated and could not easily manage. Her daughter had broken the silence that the situation required, and while the breaking of it was understandable in the way that human responses to institutional rejection are always understandable, its consequences for Camilla's already complicated position within the palace were not straightforward to absorb. She could not publicly distance herself from what Laura had done without appearing to choose the institution over her own child. She could not publicly support it without creating a conflict with Catherine that her position could not afford. She did what she has always done when the options available to her are all imperfect. She said nothing and continued conducting herself with the composure that 30 years of navigating impossible situations had built in her. Catherine's block and Laura's response will not be the last chapter of this story. The transition is still underway, and the decisions being made within it are still accumulating into the shape of something that will define the monarchy for the next generation. Each decision adds to a pattern that is becoming impossible to misread. The next reign will belong to William and Catherine, and the people inside it will be people they chose. Catherine made a decision and communicated it cleanly, without anger and without elaboration, in the specific way that people communicate decisions they are completely certain about. Laura Lopes, who had spent 20 years being the quiet one, responded in a way that nobody inside the palace had prepared for. She did not shout. She did not attack. She simply refused to absorb the experience in silence. And that refusal was enough to stun an institution that had assumed her compliance without ever asking for it. Camilla watched both of those things happen and said nothing, because saying nothing was the only option available to her that did not make an already difficult position worse. The circle around her is smaller than it has ever been. The people who once moved freely through the spaces her position opened are finding those spaces closing, one decision at a time, as the institution builds itself around a future that Camilla's family was never going to be part of. Catherine is building that future, quietly, specifically, and without apology. Subscribe and share this. There is considerably more coming.